I was standing in my driveway on a frigid February morning in Rochester, Minnesota, watching my breath turn to vapor in the sub-zero air, when Patricia Hendricks came storming across the snow-covered street with a clipboard clutched in her gloved hands. I knew right then that my day was about to take a turn for the worse. "Graham Yates," she called out, her voice sharp enough to crack ice. "We need to discuss your flagrant violation of the community guidelines." I had just finished clearing my driveway and walkway, using the same method I'd employed for the past 3 winters since moving into the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision. The snow removal company I hired, Northland Landscapes, had done their usual excellent job, and the piles of snow they'd pushed to the designated area near the street were no different than what half the neighborhood had going on. "Morning, Patricia," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "What seems to be the problem?" She thrust the clipboard toward me, her face red from either the cold or her apparent anger. "This," she said, gesturing dramatically at the snow piles, "is a complete violation of Section 7.3.2 of our HOA guidelines. You've disposed of your snow in an unauthorized manner." I stared at her, then at the snow piles, then back at her. "Patricia, this is exactly where everyone puts their snow, the same spot the plow trucks push it to, the same spot I've been using for 3 years." "Well, someone finally noticed and reported it," she snapped. "The snow must be distributed evenly across your lawn, not piled at the curb. It's unsightly and creates potential hazards." "Hazards?" I couldn't help the disbelief in my voice. "Patricia, it's Minnesota in February. Snow is everywhere. These piles will be gone by April anyway. Rules are rules, Mr. Yates. I'm giving you 48 hours to redistribute this snow properly, or you'll face a $500 fine." She turned on her heel and marched back across the street before I could respond. I stood there, absolutely bewildered, watching her disappear into her house. In my hand was a citation notice she'd somehow managed to leave behind, complete with reference numbers and highlighted sections from the HOA handbook. That evening, I called Mike Torres, the owner of Northland Landscapes. He'd been doing snow removal for houses all over Rochester for 15 years and knew the ins and outs of every subdivision's rules and regulations. "Hey, Mike, it's Graham Yates over on Maple Ridge Drive. I've got a weird situation." "What's up, Graham?" I explained Patricia's visit and her claims about the snow disposal violation. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "That's ridiculous," Mike finally said. "I've read your HOA guidelines front to back. I do that for every subdivision I work in. There's nothing in Meadowbrook Estates rules about snow distribution. In fact, the only mention of snow at all is that walkways must be cleared within 24 hours of snowfall for safety reasons." "Are you sure?" "Positive. I've got a copy of your HOA regulations right here in my office. Been using it for 3 years. Want me to email you the relevant section? Please do." 5 minutes later, I was reading through the actual HOA guidelines. Mike was right. Section 7.3.2, that Patricia had referenced, dealt with summer lawn maintenance and had absolutely nothing to do with snow removal. There was no mention anywhere of how snow should be disposed of beyond the requirement to keep walkways clear. I called Mike back. "So what do you think is going on here? Sounds like your HOA president either doesn't know her own rules or is making stuff up," he said. "I've seen it before. Some people get a little power and suddenly everything bothers them. Did you do something to tick her off recently?" I thought about it. "Not that I know of, although I did vote against her proposal to ban overnight street parking last month at the meeting." "There's your answer. Look, I'll tell you what. I'm coming by tomorrow to do your neighbor's driveway anyway. Let me talk to her." Sometimes these things just need a professional to clarify the rules. The next morning, true to his word, Mike showed up around 9. I watched from my living room window as he cleared the Johnsons' driveway next door, then walked across the street to Patricia's house. He was there for about 10 minutes before he came back over to my place. "Well," I asked, opening the door before he could knock. Mike shook his head. "She's not budging. Says she's consulted with the HOA board and they all agree this is a violation. She's threatening to fine me too for enabling violations. That's insane. It gets better. She told me if I continue to pile snow at the curb for any Meadowbrook Estates properties, she'll recommend the HOA ban our company from working in the subdivision." Now I was getting angry. "She can't do that. She claims she can. Look, Graham, I've dealt with difficult HOA boards before, but this is next level. I'd recommend you request a formal hearing. You're entitled to one before any fine is assessed. Make them show you in writing where this rule exists." That afternoon, I drafted a formal letter to the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board requesting a hearing regarding the alleged violation. I cited the specific section of the bylaws that granted homeowners the right to dispute citations, and asked for documentation showing where the snow disposal rules were outlined. I sent it via email and certified mail, just to cover my bases. While I waited for a response, I did some digging. I'd been relatively uninvolved in HOA politics since moving in, attending maybe one meeting a year and generally staying out of everyone's way. But now, I was curious about Patricia and her board. I pulled up the HOA's website, which looked like it hadn't been updated since 2019. Patricia Hendricks was listed as president, a position she'd held for 4 years. The other board members were Susan Carmichael, vice president, Ted Morrison, treasurer, and Linda Watts, secretary. There was a notice section that was supposed to announce meetings and rule changes, but the last post was from 18 months ago. My neighbor, Jeff Johnson, came over that evening with a 6-pack. "Heard you're having trouble with Patricia," he said, settling into a chair in my living room. "Word travels fast. She stopped by here this afternoon, wanted to know if I'd support the board's decision to fine you." "What you tell her?" Jeff grinned. "Told her I thought the whole thing was stupid. She wasn't happy. Then she asked if Northland did my snow removal, and when I said yes, she told me I should consider switching companies because they weren't HOA compliant. She's going after Mike's business now, seems like it. But here's the thing, Graham. You're not the first person she's pulled this kind of stunt with. Remember the Hendersons? Moved out last summer. I vaguely recalled a young couple who'd lived 3 houses down. Yeah, what about them? Patricia cited them for having a blue front door. Said it violated the approved color palette. The Hendersons fought it, showed that blue was literally on the approved list, but Patricia kept pushing. Eventually, they just got tired of the harassment and moved. That's terrible. It is. And the Robinsons before them got cited for having their trash cans visible from the street, even though they were in the designated storage area behind their fence. Patricia claimed she could see them from a certain angle on the sidewalk, which meant they weren't properly hidden. They ended up building an additional screen at their own expense just to make her stop. I was starting to see a pattern, so she's been doing this for a while. Years. The problem is most people just don't want the hassle. They pay the fine or make the changes and move on. But maybe it's time someone actually stood up to her. 3 days later, I received an email from Linda Watts, the HOA secretary. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock at the community center. The email was brief and formal, with no additional details. I called Mike Torres again. "Any chance you could come to this hearing? I think having you there to explain the landscaping perspective would help." Already planned on it, Mike said. I've been doing some research of my own. I reached out to the other landscape companies that work in Meadowbrook Estates, 3 of them. They've all been told by Patricia in the last week that they need to change their snow disposal methods, or they'll be banned from the subdivision. She's going after everyone. Looks that way. And here's the interesting part. I talked to the city's code enforcement office. They have specific regulations about snow disposal. You can't pile it in the street itself, can't block fire hydrants or mailboxes, and can't push it onto adjacent properties. Beyond that, as long as it's on your own property near the curb, it's completely legal. So even if the HOA had a rule about it, which they don't, it couldn't contradict city code. Exactly. HOAs can add restrictions, but they can't override municipal regulations. And since the city explicitly allows what we're doing, the HOA would need a really compelling reason to ban it. The hearing was held in the same community center where the subdivision held its annual summer barbecue and holiday parties. It was a small building with a main room that could hold maybe 50 people. When I arrived at 6:50, Patricia was already there along with the other 3 board members, all seated behind a folding table at the front of the room. Mike showed up a minute later, carrying a folder thick with documents. A few other neighbors trickled in as well, including Jeff Johnson, and to my surprise, at least a dozen other residents I recognized from around the neighborhood. At precisely 7, Patricia called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her knuckles on the table. This hearing concerns the violation notice issued to Graham Yates of 847 Maple Ridge Drive regarding improper snow disposal. Mr. Yates, you requested this hearing to contest the citation. I did, I said, standing up, because I don't believe I've violated any rules. Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. The violation is clearly stated. Section 7.3.2 requires that all outdoor maintenance be conducted in accordance with community standards. Your snow piles are not in accordance with these standards. Section 7.3.2 is about summer lawn maintenance, I said. It has nothing to do with snow. I've reviewed the entire HOA handbook, and there are no specific regulations about snow disposal. Susan Carmichael, the vice president, spoke up. The board has interpreted the maintenance guidelines to include winter conditions. We believe snow piles at the curb are unsightly and don't meet community standards. With all due respect, that's not how rules work, Mike interjected from his seat. You can't retroactively interpret guidelines to create new restrictions. If you want to establish rules about snow removal, you need to formally propose them, allow homeowner input, and vote on them. Patricia's face was turning red. And who are you? Mike Torres, owner of Northland Landscapes. I've been doing snow removal in this subdivision for years, and I've made it my business to understand every HOA regulation that affects my work. There is no rule about snow pile placement in the Meadowbrook Estates guidelines. Ted Morrison, the treasurer, cleared his throat. The board has discussed this matter extensively, and we're in agreement that this is a violation. Based on what? I asked. Show me the specific rule in writing. Patricia shuffled through papers on the table. The rule is implied in the general maintenance standards. Implied isn't good enough, said a voice from the back. I turned to see Martin Peters, a retired lawyer who lived 2 streets over. HOA regulations must be explicit. You cannot fine a homeowner for violating a rule that doesn't exist in writing. This isn't a court of law, Mr. Peters, Patricia said coldly. No, but HOAs are still bound by contract law and their own governing documents, Martin replied. If you assess a fine without proper basis in your written rules, Mr. Yates would have grounds to sue the HOA and he would likely win. The room was getting tense. Jeff Johnson stood up. "I'd like to know why this is suddenly an issue now. Snow has been piled at curbs in this neighborhood for as long as I've lived here, which is 8 years. Why is it only a problem now?" "Because someone filed a complaint," Patricia said. "Who?" asked another neighbor. "That's confidential." "Was there actually a complaint?" Jeff pressed. "Or did you just decide you didn't like how Graham's driveway looked?" Patricia's face was now quite red. "I don't appreciate the insinuation that this board acts on personal grudges." Mike stood up. "Let me make this simple. I have copies of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA guidelines here. I have the City of Rochester's municipal code regarding snow disposal. I have the Minnesota state statutes concerning HOA authority. None of these documents support the citation you've issued. If you proceed with this fine, you're opening the HOA to legal liability." He walked forward and placed his folder on the table in front of Patricia. "It's all in there. Every relevant regulation properly cited and highlighted. I suggest you review it before making a decision." Patricia didn't even look at the folder. "The board's decision stands. Mr. Yates has 48 hours to redistribute his snow or face a $500 fine." The room erupted in protests from several neighbors. Martin Peters was saying something about bylaws and due process. Jeff was calling the decision ridiculous. Susan and Linda were looking increasingly uncomfortable, while Ted just stared at the table. I raised my voice to be heard. "I'm not paying a fine for violating a rule that doesn't exist. If you want to formally create new guidelines about snow removal, follow the proper procedures. But you can't enforce rules that aren't written down." Patricia stood up abruptly. "This hearing is adjourned. The citation stands." She gathered her papers and walked out of the community center. Ted followed quickly after her. Susan and Linda remained for a moment, both looking uncertain before they too left. The remaining neighbors gathered around Mike and me. Martin Peters had picked up the folder Mike left and was leafing through it. "This is all solid," Martin said. "Mike's right. There's no basis for the citation." "So what do I do?" I asked. "Don't pay the fine. When they try to enforce it, they'll need to either take you to small claims court or place a lien on your property. Either way gives you the opportunity to challenge them formally. And based on what I've seen here, they don't have a leg to stand on." A woman I didn't know well, Nancy something, spoke up. "Patricia tried to fine us last year for having our Christmas lights up too long. She said they had to be down by January 15th. But the guidelines say January 31st. When we pointed this out, she backed down but never apologized." Others began sharing similar stories. It seemed Patricia had been interpreting rules creatively for years, usually backing down when challenged but occasionally managing to intimidate homeowners into compliance. "Someone needs to run against her in the next election," Jeff said. "When is that anyway?" "Should be this spring," Martin said. "Elections are supposed to happen in April according to the bylaws, though I don't think Patricia announced that there would be one this year." "She has to," Mike said. "It's not optional." "She does a lot of things she's not supposed to do," Nancy replied. Over the next few days, I waited to see what would happen. The 48-hour deadline came and went. My snow piles remained exactly where they were. I had braced myself for some kind of retaliation, but nothing came. A week later, I received a letter in the mail from the HOA. It was a formal notice stating that I had been fined $500 for failure to correct a violation. Payment was due within 30 days. If I didn't pay, they would assess additional penalties and potentially file a lien against my property. I scanned the letter and emailed it to Martin Peters. He called me back within an hour. "They're really doing this," he said. "Okay, here's what we do. I'm going to draft a response for you." We'll challenge the fine on the basis that no valid rule was violated. We'll cite the specific sections of your HOA bylaws that require rules to be in writing and properly documented. And we'll request a formal hearing with the full HOA membership present, not just the board. Can they refuse that? They can try, but the bylaws are pretty clear. Any homeowner can call for a general meeting with a petition signed by 10% of the residents. How many houses are in Meadowbrook Estates? About 60. So you need 6 signatures. That should be easy based on the turnout at your hearing. He was right. By the end of the weekend, I had 12 signatures from neighbors who wanted a full community meeting to discuss the snow disposal issue, and more broadly, the way Patricia was running the HOA. I submitted the petition on Monday morning via email and certified mail. The bylaws required the board to schedule the meeting within 30 days of receiving a valid petition. Patricia called me that evening. Her voice was tight with controlled anger. "What exactly do you think you're accomplishing with this stunt?" she demanded. "I'm exercising my rights as a homeowner," I said calmly. "You issued a fine based on a rule that doesn't exist. I'm not going to pay it. The board has the authority to interpret community standards. The board has the authority granted to it by the bylaws. And the bylaws don't give you the power to create new rules without proper procedure. You're making this much harder than it needs to be, Graham. Just spread out your snow and pay the fine. This will all go away. I'm not paying for a violation I didn't commit. Schedule the community meeting like you're required to." She hung up without another word. 2 weeks later, I received notice that a special community meeting was scheduled for March 10th at 7 in the evening. The agenda listed only one item: discussion of HOA enforcement procedures. In the meantime, winter continued. Another 2 snowstorms hit Rochester, and each time Northland Landscapes came out to clear my driveway, pushing the snow to the same location at the curb. I half expected Patricia to issue additional citations, but none came. Jeff told me she'd been going around the neighborhood asking people not to attend the community meeting, claiming it was a waste of time. Most people he talked to planned to come anyway. Mike Torres was doing his own outreach. He'd contacted all the landscape companies working in Meadowbrook Estates, and several were planning to send representatives to the meeting. The snow disposal issue had become bigger than just my fine. If Patricia succeeded in enforcing her interpretation of the rules, every snow removal company would have to change their procedures, which would increase costs for homeowners. The night before the meeting, Martin Peters came by my house. He brought copies of several documents: the original HOA bylaws from when the subdivision was established, the current HOA guidelines, Minnesota state statutes regarding HOA governance, and case law from similar disputes in other communities. "I'm planning to speak tomorrow night," he said. "I want to lay out very clearly why this fine is improper and why the board's attempt to enforce it sets a dangerous precedent. I appreciate this, Martin. I know you didn't have to get involved." He waved off my thanks. "I've been watching Patricia run roughshod over this community for years. It bothers me. I'm retired now and I have time to do something about it. Besides, this is exactly the kind of case I used to love as a practicing attorney. Clear-cut abuse of authority. You think she'll back down? Honestly, I don't know. She's pretty stubborn. But I think when the community sees how flimsy her justification is, she'll lose support. The other board members might pressure her to drop it." The community center was packed on March 10th. I arrived 15 minutes early, and the small parking lot was already nearly full. Inside, every chair was taken and people were standing along the walls. I estimated at least 50 of the 60 households were represented. Patricia looked taken aback when she entered with the other board members. She'd probably expected a small gathering like the original hearing. Instead, she was facing most of the neighborhood. She called the meeting to order at 7 sharp. This special meeting was called by petition to discuss HOA enforcement procedures. However, the board's authority remains clear. We will not be debating decisions that have already been made. That's not how this works, Patricia, Martin Peters said from his seat in the front row. A community meeting means the community gets to speak. You don't get to control the discussion. I'm the president of this HOA, and you serve at the pleasure of the homeowners. We own this community. The board merely manages it on our behalf. Patricia's jaw clenched. Fine. Who wants to speak? At least 15 hands went up. Patricia looked annoyed but pointed to a man in the second row I recognized as David Kent. I want to know why Graham Yates is being fined for something that isn't in our rules, David said. I've lived here for 12 years. I've read the HOA guidelines. There's nothing about snow piles. The board has the authority to enforce community standards, Patricia said, repeating her now familiar line. Show us where it says that, someone called out. Patricia fumbled with her papers. Section 9.2 grants the board enforcement authority. Martin stood up. May I? At Patricia's reluctant nod, he continued. Section 9.2 states that the board may enforce rules outlined in the HOA guidelines. It doesn't give the board the power to create new rules. That requires a different process, outlined in Section 3.4, which mandates written proposals, a comment period, and a vote by the full membership. We're not creating new rules, Susan Carmichael interjected. We're interpreting existing ones. What existing rule? Jeff Johnson asked. Section 7.3.2 is about lawn maintenance. It mentions mowing heights and summer landscaping. It doesn't say anything about snow. Ted Morrison finally spoke up. The board felt that the spirit of the maintenance guidelines included winter conditions. The spirit? Martin's voice was incredulous. You can't fine someone based on the spirit of a rule. Legal documents require precise language for a reason. If you want to establish snow disposal guidelines, write them up properly and let the community vote. The discussion continued for another 30 minutes. Person after person stood up to question the fine. Several shared their own stories of questionable citations from Patricia over the years. A few people defended the board, saying that someone needed to maintain standards, but they were in the clear minority. Mike Torres spoke about the practical aspects of snow removal, explaining why pushing snow to the curb was standard practice and how alternative methods would be costly and inefficient. He brought up the city code again, noting that municipal regulations explicitly allowed the current approach. Finally, Patricia held up her hand for silence. Regardless of all this discussion, the board has made its decision. The fine stands. If Mr. Yates refuses to pay, we'll place a lien on his property as outlined in our enforcement procedures. Actually, you can't, Martin said. He was holding up a document. This is a copy of your own bylaws. Section 9.5 states that before any lien can be placed, the homeowner must be given the opportunity to appeal to the full board, and then to the community if they're still unsatisfied. Graham was given a hearing with the board, but this is his appeal to the community. So let's vote. All those in favor of upholding the $500 fine against Graham Yates, raise your hands. 3 hands went up. Patricia, Ted, and one other homeowner I didn't recognize. All opposed. The rest of the room raised their hands, at least 45 people. The fine is rejected, Martin declared. Patricia was shaking with anger. That's not a valid vote. This meeting wasn't called to vote on board decisions. Section 5.8 of your bylaws, Martin said calmly. The community membership retains final authority over all HOA matters. Any decision by the board can be overturned by a majority vote of the full membership. This is your own rule book, Patricia. You don't get to ignore the parts you don't like. The room was silent for a moment. Then Susan Carmichael said quietly, "He's right, Patricia. I checked the bylaws before the meeting. The membership can overturn board decisions." Patricia looked at Susan with something like betrayal in her eyes. "You're supposed to support the board." "I'm supposed to follow the rules," Susan replied, "and Martin is correct. The fine can't stand if the community rejects it." Linda Watts nodded in agreement. Ted Morrison looked uncertain but didn't argue. Patricia stood up abruptly. "Fine. The fine is withdrawn. But don't think this means you can do whatever you want. The board will be drafting proper snow disposal guidelines for the community to vote on." "That's your prerogative," Martin said, "as long as you follow the correct procedure." Patricia gathered her things and left without another word. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, with several homeowners asking questions about other HOA policies and the upcoming board elections in April. As people began to file out, many stopped to shake my hand or pat me on the shoulder. Nancy came over with a smile. "I'm going to run for board president in April. I hope you'll support me." "Absolutely," I said. Jeff caught up with me in the parking lot. "Well, that was intense. Think Patricia will actually let this go?" "I doubt it. She doesn't seem like the type to forgive and forget." I was right. The following week, I received another letter from the HOA. This one informed me that my dues were being increased by $200 for the remainder of the year to cover additional administrative costs associated with special meetings and legal consultations. I forwarded the letter to Martin, who called me back sounding outraged. "She can't do this. Dues increases have to be approved by the full board and announced 30 days in advance. This is pure retaliation. What do? Don't pay it." "I'm going to file a formal complaint with the Minnesota Attorney General's office. The state has regulations about HOA governance and Patricia is violating several of them." Over the next few weeks, things escalated quickly. Patricia attempted to issue several other questionable citations to homeowners who had supported me at the community meeting. Jeff got a notice about his mailbox being the wrong shade of black. Nancy was told her window shutters violated the architectural guidelines, even though they'd been there for 5 years. David Kent was cited for parking his truck in his own driveway because it was supposedly a commercial vehicle, despite being a standard pickup he used personally. Each person challenged their citation. Martin was working overtime, drafting responses and gathering documentation. He compiled everything into a comprehensive complaint to the Minnesota Attorney General's office about HOA abuse. Meanwhile, the board election was approaching. Nancy had formally announced her candidacy for president. 2 other neighbors, both reasonable people I knew casually, were running for the other board positions. Patricia announced she would seek re-election, and Ted Morrison was also running again, but Susan and Linda both declined to continue serving. The campaigning, if you could call it that, was subtle but intense. Patricia went door to door asking for support, emphasizing the need for strong leadership to maintain property values. Nancy focused on transparency and following proper procedures. Mike Torres was still dealing with fallout from Patricia's vendetta against landscape companies. She'd continued trying to convince homeowners to switch to a different company, one run by her nephew, as it turned out. When Mike discovered this connection, he brought it to Martin's attention. "That's a conflict of interest," Martin said. "Board members can't use their position to benefit family members financially. This gets worse every day." On April 15th, the HOA held its annual meeting and board elections. Once again, the community center was packed. The meeting started with standard reports about the budget and upcoming community events, but everyone was clearly waiting for the election results. When it came time to count ballots, Patricia insisted on handling them herself. Martin objected immediately. "The bylaws require an independent count," he said. "The candidates can't count their own ballots." "That's never been the procedure before," Patricia snapped. "It's in Section 4.7 of the bylaws. Would you like me to read it aloud?" Reluctantly, Patricia agreed to let 3 neutral homeowners count the ballots. The process took about 20 minutes. When the results were announced, Nancy had won the presidency by a landslide, 41 votes to Patricia's 12. The 2 new board members also won decisively. Patricia's face was ashen. "This is a mistake. You're all making a huge mistake." "The community has spoken," Nancy said firmly but not unkindly. "Thank you for your years of service, Patricia." Patricia stood up, grabbed her coat, and walked out without another word. The mood in the room immediately lightened. People were chatting and laughing, clearly relieved. Nancy took over as president immediately, since the bylaws stated that new officers assumed their duties upon election. Her first act was to formally rescind all the questionable citations that had been issued in recent weeks, including the attempts to charge increased dues. She also announced that the new board would be conducting a full review of enforcement procedures to ensure they aligned with the written guidelines. I thought that would be the end of it. Patricia had lost her position and her ability to harass the neighborhood, but I was wrong. 2 weeks later, Mike Torres called me with disturbing news. "Graham, did you authorize any landscaping work at your house this week?" "No, why?" "Because someone filed a work order with the city claiming that you were planning major landscaping changes that would affect the drainage for your street. The city sent an inspector out." "That's insane. I haven't done anything." "I know." The inspector was confused too. "But he had to do a full survey of your property since a complaint was filed. And get this, the complaint came from Patricia Hendricks. She's still going after me. It's worse than that. She's filed similar complaints about 6 different properties, all people who spoke against her at the meetings. The city is getting annoyed because these are all clearly false reports, but they have to investigate each one." I called Martin to tell him what was happening. He sighed heavily. "This is harassment. We might need to consider a restraining order." "Can you even get a restraining order against someone for filing city complaints?" "If we can show a pattern of harassment meant to cause distress, yes. And I think we have that pattern now. But there's something else I need to tell you. The Attorney General's office got back to me about the complaint I filed. They're opening an investigation into the Meadowbrook Estates HOA's governance practices over the past 4 years. 4 years. That's how long Patricia has been president. Exactly. They want to review financial records, meeting minutes, all the citations issued, everything. And they've asked to interview several homeowners, including you. The investigation took several months. During that time, Patricia continued her harassment campaign. She filed noise complaints with the police about parties that weren't happening. She reported several homeowners to the city for code violations that didn't exist. She even tried to contest the HOA election, claiming irregularities, but the Attorney General's office shut that down quickly. Nancy and the new board were doing excellent work cleaning up the HOA's operations. They created clear written guidelines for everything from snow removal to holiday decorations. They established transparent procedures for citations and appeals. And they held monthly meetings where any homeowner could voice concerns. In July, the Attorney General's office released their findings. It was damning. Patricia had misused HOA funds on multiple occasions, paying for personal expenses and funneling contracts to her nephew's business without proper bidding processes. She had issued over 60 citations in 4 years, 43 of which were found to be without proper basis. And she had failed to hold required elections and meetings on several occasions. The report recommended that Patricia be permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in Minnesota. It also suggested that criminal charges might be appropriate for the misuse of funds, which totaled over $15,000. 2 weeks later, the Rochester Police Department showed up at Patricia's house. I watched from my window as they led her out in handcuffs. Later that day, the local news reported that Patricia Hendricks had been arrested for theft by swindle and fraud, related to her embezzlement of HOA funds. The neighborhood was shocked, though perhaps we shouldn't have been. Looking back, all the signs were there. Her aggressive enforcement of questionable rules, her refusal to follow proper procedures, her retaliation against anyone who challenged her. It had all been about control and, apparently, covering up financial misdeeds. Patricia's case went to trial in October. Martin testified about the HOA governance issues. Nancy presented evidence of the financial irregularities the new board had uncovered. Mike Torres explained how Patricia had tried to force homeowners to use her nephew's company. And I gave my account of the snow disposal citation and everything that followed. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Patricia was found guilty on 3 counts of theft and 2 counts of fraud. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison and ordered to pay restitution to the HOA. After the trial, life in Meadowbrook Estates slowly returned to normal. The new board under Nancy's leadership was fair and transparent. The bogus citations disappeared. People felt comfortable in their own homes again without fear of arbitrary enforcement actions. Mike Torres continued doing snow removal for half the neighborhood, pushing snow to the curb like always. Nobody complained. In fact, when the next winter arrived, the new board formally adopted snow disposal guidelines that explicitly allowed the standard practice of piling snow near the curb, as long as it didn't block sidewalks, fire hydrants, or mailboxes. I ran into Ted Morrison at the grocery store in November, several months after Patricia's sentencing. He looked embarrassed when he saw me. "Graham, I owe you an apology," he said. "I should have stood up to Patricia when this whole snow thing started. I knew she was wrong, but I went along with it anyway." "Water under the bridge," I said. "Or snow under the plow, I guess," he smiled weakly. "I should have been braver. When someone abuses their authority, staying silent makes you complicit. I learned that the hard way." We all learned something from this. That December, as another Minnesota winter settled in and the snow began to fall, I watched Mike and his crew clear my driveway. They pushed the snow to its usual spot near the curb, creating a neat pile that would melt away in the spring. No citations came. No angry phone calls or threatening letters. Jeff came over that evening with another 6-pack. We sat in my living room, watching the snow fall outside the window. "Hard to believe it's been almost a year since this whole mess started," he said. "Feels like longer." "You did a good thing, standing up to her. A lot of people wouldn't have bothered." "I was just defending myself. I didn't set out to take down the HOA president." "No, but when you saw something wrong, you didn't let it go. That matters." "This neighborhood is better now because you wouldn't back down." I thought about that. About the citation, I'd received that cold February morning and everything that had spiraled out from it. Patricia's abuse of power had affected dozens of people over the years. Maybe if someone had stood up to her earlier, things wouldn't have gotten so bad. But they did get bad, and eventually someone had to say enough was enough. I had help, I said. Mike knowing the rules, Martin understanding the legal side, you and the other neighbors supporting me. It wasn't just me. True. But you were the one who got fined and refused to pay it. That took guts. We talked for a while longer, eventually shifting to lighter topics like the Viking season and whether we should plan another neighborhood barbecue once the weather warmed up. Normal things. The kind of casual conversation that happened in communities where people felt safe and respected. Later that night, alone in my house, I pulled up the HOA guidelines on my computer. The new snow removal section was clearly written and sensible. It protected everyone's rights while maintaining reasonable standards for the community. That's what rules should be: clear, fair, and applied consistently. I thought about Patricia, sitting in a prison cell paying for her crimes. I didn't feel good about it exactly. I hadn't wanted to ruin her life. I just wanted her to follow her own rules. But she'd made her choices, from that first bogus citation all the way through to embezzling HOA funds and harassing neighbors, even after losing her position. The snow continued falling outside, soft and steady. Tomorrow, Mike would be back to clear it again. The piles would grow at the curb through the winter months, then gradually melt away in spring. Simple. Normal. The way it should be. My phone buzzed with a text from Nancy. The HOA board was planning a community meeting in January to discuss plans for spring landscaping and summer events. She wanted to know if I'd be interested in joining the architectural review committee. I smiled and texted back that I'd think about it. A year ago, I'd been completely uninvolved in HOA affairs, preferring to stay out of everyone's way. But I'd learned that communities function best when good people participate, when reasonable voices speak up, when someone notices something wrong and has the courage to challenge it. The snow disposal citation had seemed like such a small thing at first. A petty complaint from an overzealous HOA president. But it had revealed much deeper problems, and dealing with those problems had made Meadowbrook Estates a better place to live. I turned off my computer and headed upstairs to bed. Outside my window, the snow continued to fall on the quiet suburban street. Somewhere in the neighborhood, piles of snow sat peacefully at the curbs, exactly where they belonged, bothering no one. And that was exactly as it should be. The next morning, I woke to a fresh blanket of white covering everything. Mike's truck was already rumbling down the street, his plow efficiently clearing driveways. I watched him work on the Johnson's house next door, admiring the practiced ease with which he maneuvered the equipment. He finished and pulled into my driveway. I grabbed my coat and went outside to chat with him while he worked. "Morning, Graham," he called out over the noise of the truck. "Morning, Mike. Busy day." Always is after a decent snowfall. But at least I don't have to worry about angry HOA presidents anymore. That's got to be a relief. You have no idea. I actually got a call from Nancy last week. The HOA wants to establish a preferred vendor list for various services, including snow removal. Asked if I'd be interested in being on it. That's great. Yeah, and they're doing it right this time. Open bidding, fair criteria, no nepotism. It's amazing what happens when you have competent people in charge. He finished my driveway in about 15 minutes, pushing the snow into the usual pile near the curb. All set. See you next storm. I waved as he drove off to his next client. Standing there in my cleared driveway, looking at the snow pile that had caused so much trouble a year ago, I felt a sense of satisfaction. Not because I'd won some battle, but because the neighborhood had come together to fix a real problem. Martin Peters walked by on his daily morning stroll, carefully navigating the snowy sidewalk. He saw me and changed course to come over. "Morning, Graham. Staying out of trouble, doing my best." I heard from the AG's office yesterday. Their investigation is officially closed. All the reforms Nancy's board implemented passed their review. Meadowbrook Estates is now their model for how an HOA should operate. That's quite a turnaround. It really is. Though I have to say, I miss the excitement. Life's been pretty boring without Patricia causing chaos. I laughed. I think we can all live with boring for a while. Probably right. Take care, Graham. He continued on his walk, leaving tracks in the fresh snow. I stood there a moment longer, breathing in the cold winter air, feeling grateful for the ordinary peace of a quiet morning in a well-run neighborhood. The snow disposal citation seemed like a distant memory now, even though it had only been a year. So much had changed. Patricia was in prison. Nancy was president. The HOA followed its own rules, and snow piles sat undisturbed at curbs throughout Meadowbrook Estates. It wasn't the resolution I'd expected when Patricia first came storming across the street with her clipboard. I thought maybe we'd have an argument, I'd prove my point, and that would be that. Instead, it had uncovered corruption, united a neighborhood, and ultimately made our community stronger. I went back inside to make breakfast, looking forward to a normal, uneventful day. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and the pile near my curb grew bigger. And nobody, absolutely nobody, had a problem with that. That afternoon, I decided to drive over to the community center. The building had become something of a symbol for me. The place where everything had come to a head, where the neighborhood had stood together, where justice had ultimately prevailed. The parking lot was empty on this weekday afternoon. I sat in my car for a moment, remembering the packed meetings, the heated discussions, the moment when Martin had called for that vote and the whole room had raised their hands against Patricia's citation. My phone rang. It was Mike Torres. "Hey, Graham, I'm putting together a retrospective for my business newsletter about the whole HOA situation. Would you be willing to do a short interview? I think other homeowners in other neighborhoods might benefit from hearing about what happened." "Sure, I'd be happy to." "Great. How about tomorrow afternoon?" "Works for me." We set up a time and hung up. I sat there thinking about what I might say. The whole experience had taught me so much about standing up for yourself, about community, about the importance of good governance. But most of all, it had taught me that ordinary people could make a difference when they refused to accept injustice. The snow was still falling as I drove home, coating the streets in fresh white. The plows would be out again soon, pushing it all aside, making way for normal life to continue. Just like Mike's snow removal company had done at my house that morning. Just like they'd been doing all along, following the rules, doing good work, and getting hassled by someone who thought power meant she could make up rules as she went. But that was over now. The neighborhood had course-corrected. The system, as messy and slow as it had been, had ultimately worked. That evening, several of the neighbors gathered at Jeff's house for an impromptu get-together. Nancy was there with her husband. David Kent came by. Even Susan Carmichael, the former vice president who had ultimately stood up to Patricia, stopped in. We didn't talk much about the HOA drama. That chapter had closed. Instead, we talked about normal things. The upcoming holidays, whose kids were doing what, whether we should organize a neighborhood snow sculpture contest. The kind of light, friendly conversation that happens when people feel comfortable with each other. As I walked home later that night, I looked up and down Maple Ridge Drive. Lights glowed warmly from windows. Snow lay peacefully on lawns and roofs. At each curb, neat piles of snow sat exactly where snow removal companies had placed them, bothering no one, violating no rules. It was just a neighborhood, just houses and families and normal suburban life. But it was a good neighborhood, made better by people who cared enough to stand up when something went wrong. I thought about Patricia sometimes. I wondered if she understood what had gone wrong, if she realized that her need for control had ultimately destroyed the position she'd worked so hard to maintain. Maybe she'd learn from it. Maybe not. Either way, she wouldn't be in a position to harass homeowners again. The snow crunched under my boots as I walked up my driveway. Inside, my house was warm and welcoming. I made a cup of coffee and settled into my favorite chair by the window, looking out at the quiet street. A year ago, I'd been standing in nearly this exact spot when Patricia came marching over with her citation. I'd had no idea what I was getting into, no clue that a simple dispute about snow disposal would spiral into an investigation, a trial, and ultimately a prison sentence for an embezzling HOA president. If I could go back, would I do anything differently? I didn't think so. I'd stood up for what was right. I'd refused to pay a bogus fine. And when it became clear that the problem was bigger than just one citation, I'd seen it through. The coffee warmed my hands as I sat there in the comfortable silence of my home. Tomorrow would bring whatever tomorrow brought. More snow, probably. Mike would come by to clear it. Life would go on. And if another HOA president ever tried to cite me for violating a rule that didn't exist, I'd know exactly what to do. The story of the snow disposal citation had become something of a legend in Meadowbrook Estates. New neighbors moving in would hear about it, about the HOA president who tried to fine someone for piling snow at the curb and ended up going to prison for embezzlement. It was a cautionary tale about abuse of power, but also a hopeful one about communities that stood together. I finished my coffee and got ready for bed. Outside, the snow continued its steady fall, blanketing everything in white, pure, innocent, and completely rule-compliant snow. I smiled at the thought and turned off the lights. Some battles choose you, I reflected as I drifted off to sleep. You don't go looking for them. But when they arrive at your door with a clipboard and a bogus citation, sometimes the only thing to do is stand your ground and see it through. Because communities are built on rules that apply fairly to everyone, not on the whims of whoever happens to be in charge. And snow, of course, should be allowed to pile exactly where common sense and city codes say it can pile. At the curb, out of everyone's way, melting peacefully until spring returns and the whole thing becomes irrelevant anyway. That was the real lesson of the snow disposal citation. Not just that I'd been right and Patricia had been wrong, but that simple common sense matters. That fairness matters. That following proper procedures matters. The neighborhood had learned these lessons together, and we were all better for it.